All right, guys, Murph's here. And today we're going to talk about 922R compliance. We're going to talk about when it applies and to whom it applies. Now, something that's very important for me to go ahead and identify right off the bat is that I am in no way some type of legal representation. So, nothing that I state here should be taken as legal advice. If anything, it should be enough to whet your appetite if you think 922R applies to you so that you can do more research and get more information about what it is that you need to do in order to be able to navigate this process. I will also post links in the description for some websites that I found to be very helpful in the process of doing the research for this video. First off, we need to go ahead and identify what 922R is. 922 itself is a body of regulations and laws governing the importation of products. Section R specifically covers the importation of firearms, long guns, shotguns, and rifles, to be even more specific in this case. So this is where you go when you need to figure out like what you can and can't do when it comes to importation, and subsection R covers long gun or rifle and shotgun importation. Now, in order to talk about this, I do want to go back to the 1960s, because though 922R is not like created by the 1968 Gun Control Act, it does have some implications that come from that Gun Control Act, specifically in some of the wording that got used in it. So, the 1968 Gun Control Act was meant to start putting regulations on the importation of firearms, specifically handguns, where it established a point system in which handguns had to have a variety of certain features in order to be eligible for importation. And ostensibly, this was supposed to preclude the importation of what are referred to as Saturday Night Specials, which were exceedingly low-cost firearms made from subpar materials. And this was supposed to like protect the public and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that I find interesting about that statement is that apparently it's not okay to import Saturday Night Specials, but companies like Jennings or High Point can exist because that's okay. And that's not, I'm not necessarily trash talking the existence of High Point. High Point serves a specific purpose in the market. Being able to produce a firearm for under $200 so that anybody can be armed is still something that's very important. What I find funny is that it's okay as long as it's American made, because that is a theme that's going to be ever present throughout this conversation. So a lot of the features that were being looked for were stuff that would make the firearms less applicable in a defensive type situation. So a Walther PPK would no longer be eligible for importation because it is so small. However, the PPK-S, which has a longer grip and changes and compromises the compact nature of the Walther PPK, is eligible for importation. It's the same thing with the FN or Browning Model 1922. That handgun by itself, not eligible necessarily for importation. Add target sights to it, and all of a sudden it is. And you see the same type of this target theme spread throughout. So guns being able to have adjustable sights, guns having like serrated triggers and stuff like that, which is why you would commonly see adjustable sights and serrated triggers on Glocks that were imported. Unless it was a specific LE Glock or a LE program Glock, in which case then they could have the fixed sights. And all of this is based around the statement sporting purpose, because apparently you can only import firearms for a sporting purpose, even though the Second Amendment does not make a difference or does not differentiate between imported or locally manufactured arms when it comes to the true purpose of the Second Amendment, which is defending yourself, your community, your life, your liberty, all those types of things. Apparently, it was decided in 1968 that if you were importing firearms, they could not be of a military nature. And this is also, and this is maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, so if I'm taking too long in this, you guys go ahead and like check the description and skip to the parts of this video that you want to get involved in. But I find that very interesting that this happened in the 1960s during the Cold War, when the United States was very concerned about the domino effect, which was the concern that if a communist revolution took hold in another country, that it would expand to the neighboring countries and have them fall to communism like dominoes. So the U.S. was spending a lot of time influencing democracy in other places, be it maintaining capitalist regimes or trying to upstart capitalist regimes and supplying arms in doing so. And all of a sudden the United States is like, well, we want to crack down on the importation of foreign potentially military arms and stuff like that. It's funny to me just to see that kind of like, it's not really a connection, but it's kind of a connection, more or less. Back on track. So 922R. 922R specifically covers long guns, but still has the sporting purpose clause incorporated into it. So imported long guns are supposed to have a sporting type purpose. They're supposed to have limited capacity. They're not supposed to, it's mostly based around capacity, but also that I can't be select fire and stuff like that. They cannot be the active military version of whatever type of rifle. Now, there are a couple of caveats to this, though, for how it is that you can import these arms. One, it can be a military surplus arm. Military surplus arms, all bets are off. Those are just fine as long as they're not select fire and all, the other things that keep them from being able to be imported. Unless the government decides to change their mind on that. That has happened a couple times in the past. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, we have Mosin Nagants and stuff like that coming in en masse. And in addition to that, we have SVT-38 and SVT-40 rifles. However, it would eventually be decided that the SVT-40 and SVT-38 were scary because they're semi-automatic, and they could no longer be imported. And I'm also sure that, kind of like with the Norinkos and stuff like that, sanctions probably popped up somewhere along the way as well, which of course totally changes that overall dynamic. But also, when 1.5 million M1 Garands and M1 carbines were trying to come home from Korea, South Korea specifically, the Obama administration blocked that because they are weapons of war and they're semi-automatic and stuff like that, which I think in this case is a misunderstanding of terms. This is not that infrequent for, non-gun people to not necessarily understand that stuff, or the fact that the CMP has been distributing M1 Garands and M1 carbines and 1903 Springfields to the public for, decades. That's the whole point of its existence. All of a sudden it became a big issue when it was that many surplus arms. Politics, what can you do? Oh, wow. That's really good. That's dangerous. That's dangerously good. All right, so the one instance, the one kind of caveat to this is if it's some sort of, military surplus arms, so Mausers, Mosin Nagants, short magazine Lee Enfields, all those types of guns are going to be just fine. They can come in no problem. Or you can have a certain amount of American-made parts incorporated into that firearm, at which point they're completely fine to be brought in. They're completely fine. Arms that are existing can be modified and brought in as long as they utilize X number of American-made parts. And the whole idea of this is supposed to stop somebody from going around the importation of arms by having them bring in a parts kit, a fully up and ready to go parts kit that can be brought into the United States and then reassembled with all of its foreign parts. That's supposed to preclude that as a possibility. Now, already there's a lot of other things that kind of govern parts kits and stuff like that came out in the 90s and the early 2000s. This is not a conversation about U.S. firearms importation regulations and acts and all those types of things. That would be a whole video by itself. We're just looking at 922R right now. So in this case, the X number of American-made parts. So there is a list of 20 that you're supposed to be selecting these parts from, and I'm not going to list out all 20 of them. You can go ahead and check, or I'll roll in a picture is what it is I'll wind up doing here. But you need 10 of those 20 parts incorporated into whatever long gun it is that you're bringing into the country. So when Century Arms was importing the Walser 10, they would bring in sporterized Walser 10s, and you'd see the same type of thing with the Norinco AKs once upon a time, in which it would be limited to 10 rounds. It would only be cut to be able to take the single stack 10-round magazine. It would have a bolt installed that is not able to feed from a double stack magazine or staggered stack magazine. And then, stock arrangements and stuff like that have been seen. And then they would get into the country and Century Arms would swap out those parts. The idea was supposed to be that Century Arms would replace those parts with American-made parts. And you can get to that by, the muzzle device. So those would perhaps have a welded thread cover on them. And then that weld would be broken. And then, the sugar spoon muzzle device installed on the Walser 10, which as long as it's American-made part, that go ahead and chalks up one of your parts right there. The magazine itself accounts for 3 parts. So if you include American-made magazine with the rifle, you've already got 3 of those parts right there. And then they would open up the magazine well to be able to accept the, double stack 30-round magazines, and then they would also modify the bolts in order to be able to feed from those magazines. Something very similar as well with the Benelli M4. Those come in a 5-round configuration. You can modify them to be able to hold 8 rounds, but you have to use an American-made part in order to do it. Or at least you're supposed to. Okay. All right, so how does this apply, Murph? Because right now we're talking a lot about like importation. Your average citizen is not importing foreign-made arms. They're buying arms that are already on the market. So how does this impact someone on an individual level? Well, a lot of it comes down to whenever it is that you're taking existing sporting arms from foreign countries and modifying them out of their original configuration. So take Sega, which I previously reviewed a Sega on the channel, link in the description. That was a Sega 308. If I took that 308 and I decided that I wanted to make it more AK pattern, which, if you don't know, the Sega 308 is a sporterized, like a standardized sporterized AK pattern rifle. But there's some major differences that make it not necessarily eligible to work with standard AK anything, as it turns out. So like the trigger group is moved further to the rear of the receiver as opposed to being right behind the magazine well. And this is the sporting purpose of this. But you can move that trigger group forward in order to be able to give it more of the standard AK pattern operation, manual of arms, all those types of things. Swap out the stocks and stuff like that. You can pop like regular AK stocks on there instead of the sporter stocks that they came with. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with those. However, in the process of doing that, you are modifying it from its original configuration, and you need to, as you modify those things, you need to make sure that you're keeping the parts count correct. Okay, well, Murph, how is anybody going to know? Well, and this is where we get into the tricky portion of this. This is where it makes, this is where like I'm not a legal representative type of thing comes in. How to go about this? The possibility that somebody is targeting individuals over the modifications that they've made to their firearms and onesies and such is pretty low. It's not to say that no one has ever been arrested for it or seen, jail time or a fine or anything along those lines for it. I'm sure there has. Within, an infinite realm of possibilities, that is definitely in there. However, a lot of it comes down to how it is that you spotlight yourself. It's kind of like whenever it is that we talk about like the NFA. Okay, well, just because I take my AR pistol upper and throw it on a rifle lower doesn't mean that I suddenly killed someone. That's not how that works. That did not suddenly turn that weapon into some sort of autonomous firearm that can run around and dispense death as it sees fit. It still needs a human attached to it. So if somebody doesn't necessarily have murder as an intent, they're not really going to go and like kill a bunch of people with the SBR that they just made, regardless of whether or not they have a tax stamp for it. Like, those are technically victimless crimes. I was at a range one time and a dude was sitting there shooting like a Mark 18 type setup, and I asked him, because I was getting ready to build my first SBR, hey, how long did it take to get your tax stamp back? And he was like, I just popped a stock on this to come out here. Normally this is my pistol, but I wanted to shoot further and I wanted an actual stock, so I put a stock on it. And I was like, oh, okay, casual felony. But you know what? He didn't kill anyone that day. So was it that big of an issue? Now, of course, the other side of this here, guys, is that if we're talking about like taking the moral high ground and all that type of stuff, we as gun owners often like to say, like, we are not the problem. If we were the problem, you would know it. We are law-abiding gun owners. We're doing the things that it is that we are supposed to do. We should not be treated like criminals. And you only really get to say that as long as you're not actually acting like a criminal, which would include paying your tax stamps, not building suppressors and all that kind of stuff, and trying to get one over on the ATF, because that is how you wind up in jail, and hopefully you don't have a dog. I, on the other hand, like animals. I like my dog, and I would prefer that I not have them shot by the police. Also, whenever someone goes through the process of building out like a Sega or something along those lines, they're going to post it on the internet. If you built a Sega 12 into a tactical little setup and stuff like that, there's no way you're not going to hop on your social media and talk about it. And that at that point, you are putting information out there that maybe you don't want to. And I think people forget about that a lot in social media and stuff like that, that, like, everyone can see it, which means that, like, everyone can see it. If it's on the internet, it's accessible. And that's why, like, you got to be careful about what it is that you're throwing out there. And you got to make sure that you're being right about what it is that you throw out there. The private citizen is highly unlikely to be impacted by 922R, is the long and the short of it. It's not impossible at all. Whenever it is that you're talking about a business, let's say that you're a gunsmith and you're like, you know what, it'd be really cool if I started building like custom AKs on this as a part of my business. All right, so you start buying AK parts kits and stuff like that. You need to be on the up and up, because when you start producing guns in volume, that is when you start to attract even more attention, more so than just making some Instagram posts about like your new Sega build that you just completed and how happy you are about it. When you start selling firearms, like potentially regulated parts and stuff like that, that's when you attract attention. So if you're someone looking to get involved in that, or if you're looking to buy products from somebody involved in that type of thing, you need to keep track of that, because that's stuff that the ATF will start to pay attention to. It's no different than the guy at the gun show who's selling 1/2x28 oil filter thread adapters. Like, he may not get arrested on the spot, but somebody's going to start taking an interest in his business potentially. A friend of mine was at a machine gun shoot some years ago with the ATF. Not as a member of the ATF, he just happened to be there at the same time that some agents were that he was working with at the time. And they were going around the tables and stuff like that, and there was a fella who was selling Glock switches. He just wasn't calling them Glock switches. And they went ahead and got his business card. And you can bet that they contacted him later, and they eventually probably got the records of everyone he sold those items to. A friend of mine had an FRT trigger, and back when like all the back and forth was going on with the FRT and stuff like that, as that lawsuit was winding down, the ATF contacted him and said, hey, we know you have an FRT trigger. So you can do this one of two ways. You can bring it to us and we'll destroy it, or you can show us proof of destruction, but you need to get rid of that. He held out for as long as he could, and then eventually he did turn it over to them for destruction. You got to be careful whenever it is that you start to tangle with this stuff en masse or at scale. And this is why it's always prudent to be above board with whatever it is that you're doing. Especially since when it comes to parts kits, because of already previously existing parts kits, like the receiver's going to be cut up, so you're going to need a new receiver. The barrels are going to be removed. You're going to need a barrel. You're going to need, you're going to need all these parts. You're already building that list. It's going to be pretty easy to get to 10 really fast. Now, also included in the description will be a website that actually helps you kind of like negotiate the process of going through 922R. So if you're interested in that type of thing, or you're trying to be compliant and all that kind of stuff, go ahead and check out that link in the description. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.